Great. So welcome, everyone. I am not Brad or Mary Power. I'm just using his login to host the meeting. I'm Robert Ellis. I'm patient number 5 in the prostate cancer lab, standing in for Brad Power, who is traveling today. Our guests are Peter Kuhn and Stephanie Shishido. We're going to be talking today about liquid biopsies, which I am very much interested in. Liquid biopsies enable less invasive, more frequent and lower cost data about disease, which could revolutionize treatment. And we're going to be talking today about the cutting edge of liquid biopsies and their ability to inform patients about their disease, predict progress, and guide treatment decisions. Peter Kuhn, PhD, is founder and chief scientific advisor at Epic Sciences, which develops liquid biopsies, which are just blood tests to inform cancer patients on their best course of therapy. Dr. Kuhn is the Dean's Professor of Biological Sciences, Professor of Medicine, Aerospace and Mechanical Engineering and Biomedical Engineering at the University of Southern California. He also serves as the Director of the USC Michelson Convergent Science Institute in Cancer and the Deputy Director of the Convergent Science Virtual Cancer Center. Dr. Shishido is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the USC Michelson Center for Convergent Bioscience, focusing on the identification and characterization of circulating tumor cells from the liquid biopsy received from clinical trial cancer patients. Her research interests focus on the interactions between the neoplastic cell and the microenvironment. What's that? Oh. Epic's comprehensive cancer profiling approach uses multiple technologies to provide up to 3 types of analysis, all based on a single blood draw. Their proven and proprietary circulating tumor cell capabilities, along with circulating tumor DNA and immune cell analysis, allow for a clearer and more efficient picture for both prostate and breast cancer. Their approach reveals both genotypic and phenotypic data and can offer the most actionable, personalized liquid biopsy available. And specifically of interest to us, the ARV7 test identifies patients who are likely to be resistant to androgen-directed therapies such as abiraterone, enzalutamide, or apalutamide. The liquid biopsy test for ARV7 is the first and only Medicare reimbursed, clinically validated predictive CTC liquid biopsy test for metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Peter.
Great, thank you for the introduction. Quick addendum, Stephanie has retired from her role as a postdoctoral fellow because of the success of what she has done during that time period, and is now actually Director of Clinical Research within CSI-Cancer, and is responsible for a substantial portfolio of clinical research applications that range all the way into CAR T therapies for prostate cancer. We won't talk about this today. That is for a future conversation, and why it is that we are involved with what we think are the best groups in the world working on this. And how we think that we can actually hopefully help and support them in their mission to enable CAR T therapy in prostate cancer, which has been, one of the challenges up until now. Today is really meant as a discussion, as an information. I want to be most helpful to you guys, so I have slides because that's what an academic does. So I do have slides. I have 30 slides that might be useful for this conversation, but I am just as happy, if not even happier, if this is really simply a conversation driven by questions that you have when you hear the keyword liquid biopsy. So let me start first with actually saying, hey, what is it that comes to mind?
All right, no, you gotta go.
No,
you gotta go.
I'm listening.
Hey, oh wow. Oh, if Nick is actually listening to me.
And getting from point A to point B.
Sorry,
It's gonna take us
if
6
you
months
aren't speaking,
to have
if
a
you could please
product
mute
that I
yourself.
feel actually good about having David Vogel or somebody go through, right? 6 months.
Hey,
Unless we go with cure base, and then
if one
Please
of
mute
it's gonna
yourself.
be like a ready-made.
Hey.
So
Hey.
I,
whoever is co-host,
There we go.
oh, boom.
I think I've muted everyone. Apologies for that.
It's all good. No, just poor Nick. This is going to be so embarrassing when he actually comes online and we tell him that he was live. So let me first do a quick question. When you hear the keyword liquid biopsy, what comes to mind? What comes to mind first? Either what question or what fact. Either way around could work. Anybody wants to raise their hand? Rick, fire away.
Go ahead, Rick. You raised your hand first.
Yeah. It was 2017. I was at Human Longevity, and I heard about this company called Grail, and I thought this will never work. It's like finding an attack submarine in deep water in the ocean, which I did that job. And it's never going to work. And then I am just amazed, and I've told my wife that she's just had breast cancer. She should have and she's under UCLA. I'll be quick. So she had a lumpectomy, no genomic sequencing. And I have been listening to The Drive, Peter Attia, and Circulating Tumor Cells, his guest Max Diem, I think out of Stanford. And it came to me like, hey, hon, you should have your primary, your tumor sequenced so that someday circulating tumor cells will be able to identify reoccurrence way before radio, imaging. And she's like, really? So, because she's got a little thing, is calcification, is it coming back? I mean, and I said, you need to do this, but it didn't happen yet. I just had this conversation with her yesterday. And then, I've been enthralled with Max Diem's great podcast, and it's helping me understand. And then the last thing is, if there is time for me, I am going to see, I call him Dr. T at Providence St. John's in Culver City. He's like a prostate cancer expert. And his portfolio of what I've heard, he can do all these cutting edge things, and circulating and CAR T should be on the list, but I'm under care at UCLA, and these things aren't even thought about. So I'm excited, and wouldn't mind if you just said, hey, you should be thinking about this, because I'm hopeful for Dr. T at Providence that'll do some spatial, be able to do some more advanced care than I'm getting at, let's say, where you'd get in a comprehensive cancer center, which is great, but I think follow the book, very conservative. So I'm excited. Okay.
Thanks, Rick. I think Jeff was next, and then John.
Yeah, I've been working a little bit with a woman in France, Catherine Alex Panabier. You may know her pretty well. So I've done a little bit of work with her. So I'm one of the many things interested in, the distinctions between ctDNA, CTCs, and the, everything else, cell-free DNA, ctRNA, all the different aspects of it. And the applications, when I worked a little bit with Mass General, I'm in the Boston area, so the other end of the spectrum, but we worked a little bit with a torpedo diagnostics, which had a CTC as a launch, that then got rolled back into Mass General, looking at CTCs, but for not original detection of cancer, but looking for remission or recurrence of cancer, particularly in liver cancer. So they were using CTCs to do that. So it's interesting to see the way the applications are rolling out in some of these areas, and to try to better understand the distinction between some of these. So I'm not sure if that's in your scope for today, but I'll listen.
No,
Thank you.
no. This is great. John, you go next.
Hey, Peter, thank you for coming and presenting. Really appreciate it. Super important topic. I'm a medical doctor, medical advocate. I'm not a treating physician. My role is really to identify resources, testing resources, and treatment resources. So my questions are coming from that perspective. One, it seems like this is the Wild West. I really do not have clarity on which types are going to Jeff's question. I don't have clarity on which types of these liquid biopsies are relevant for which types of tumors at which stage in their progression. The second concern I have is finding practitioners who are nimble and are willing to do serial liquid biopsies so we can be addressing genetic changes along the way. And thirdly, some of these tests are more robust if you're getting live tumor tissue plus blood liquid biopsies. That's often pretty hard to find a patient who can get all that done at the same time. And then thirdly, the costs of these tests are out of bounds for most people, especially if they're done on a serial basis.
Okay, awesome. Love it. Okay, so this is actually great because each one of you actually hinted on a couple of really important aspects here. So Max Dean, super good friend, super good colleague, and we're actually working together with him on our early lung cancer detection program. Another super fun, super important conversation. Jeff, I'm sorry you're stuck in Boston. I eventually escaped from the Northeast. I did my tour, but with MGH, so it's Mehmet Toner and Dan Haber, one of my absolute favorite competitors in the whole world. I mean, it is just awesome. Publicly, we chew each other apart, but privately, we're actually really good friends. Huge amount of respect for them. And what you saw there with like rolling out, coming back in, actually also then speaks to John's comment of, hey, it's the Wild West.
Yes.
And so Catherine Alex Panabiers is, of course, one of our counterparts in Europe. And she has done lots of super interesting things, but it's to me a little bit more of, and I'm German, you know, the French, we always have a challenging relationship. So it's a little bit more of the Wild West over there in France. But again, hopefully we'll actually we'll get to that. And part of the commentary around Wild West is also important when it comes to the context of what is it that they do at comprehensive cancer centers versus at some of the private clinics, right? I'm always, and I've said this in these meetings before, you know, I'm a scientist. Obviously, I am all for research, but guys, please be thoughtful around what is evidence-based and have a true understanding of the risks that we are taking when we're going with early stage technologies. Okay, it's really, really important because that's a big part of this sea change. And this is not everybody who was on the call when I started saying this. What we have seen is this sea change really in part driven by that revolution of the liquid biopsy that has really changed the face of cancer research. 15 years ago, it was all about model systems and mice and cell lines and all this stuff, right? And with liquid biopsies, we have been able to actually start using the human as our model system. And it doesn't get any better than that. Doing discovery together with the patient, with the tumor from the patient, that's exactly what cancer research needs to do. And so we have seen this huge change of really making real progress of doing basic discovery with the patient, then validating it, right? And then getting back out into clinical care with validated product. This is complicated. It's going to feel like, oh my God, this is too expensive, or this will never work. Hey, wait a minute, somebody failed. So they're pulling it back in, right? Companies come and they go. What's going on, right? So I'm hoping that we can work our way through that for a little bit. So maybe I'll actually start off with a few slides, and I'm first. So this is one. This is a bit of a tribute to Rick, okay? Because there's something important that has happened as we worked our way through over this last 20 years of research in the liquid biopsy. So when you see this little post stamp on that slide right now, right, you're going to be like, what the? Most of you are like, I don't know, Peter, is it a broken slide? There is no information there. Okay, this is noise. This is nothing but noise, right? So, but then it's an animation, right? So you're like, all right, ocean, I don't know, a boat, something in the ocean, right? So then you're like, oh, there's a second boat. Oh, that second boat is a little bigger. Huh, bunch of boats, right? So what is it, right? Eventually, right, Rick should be like, wait a minute, there's a chopper overhead. This is like a whole fleet. Wait a minute. If these guys are all here, right, the actual carrier can't be far.
Oh my gosh. I worked on the sonar system that was dropped from that helicopter and would go 40 miles in front of the carrier group looking for deep threat as to this we use SH-60 Sikorsky helicopters. I designed all the and it was hard. It was a hard problem.
Right. So this is a hard.
That's hilarious.
Okay? So this is a really hard problem, right? And we started off by doing nothing else but looking for the carrier only, right? Because the carrier is the actual, you know, that's our big problem, right? That's our big hit. That's the one we need to like put out of commission. Everybody else is there to protect, right? To work with it, right? But at some point somewhere, there's enough signal around to say, no, the carrier is there. I know the carrier. I might not be able to see it right now, but I know it's there. Okay. So I'm going to come back to this a bit over and over, but obviously with that very first, where we have to be careful, right? When I only see this, I have very, very little certainty on whether or not the full carrier group is there and the carrier is there, right? As I'm adding information, right, I get to higher and higher and higher certainty, right? And somewhere in there, I know I need to strike, right? But it's always this risk balance because typically our information is incomplete, okay? I want to always keep that in mind. So again, we're going to walk through this, the introduction. Yes, professor at USC. The reason for all the other titles is simply because I was recruited into USC to build something that is really focused on patient benefit. Okay, super unique. There's not very many places. None of the Boston schools, sorry, Jeff, none of the Boston schools could ever get there because their ego gets in the way. In fact, that's true for Northern California as well, right? Because it's too much about empire building. In fact, the creativity within Los Angeles is really allowing us to really be driven by patient benefit. It's a fantastic place to do it. It's a great way to make progress. And obviously the best way to do that, which is why I love teasing our colleagues at the outset, but of course we work very closely with all of them around the country. Quick disclosure here. Yes, we started Epic Sciences with technology to be developed in the lab. CSI is a digital health company, and I'm advising a bunch of other companies. But most importantly, please, 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 I'm just a physicist. Okay, I am not a physician. I am not a healthcare provider whatsoever. What I didn't put on this slide is I never took a biology class either. Okay, this is really coming, all this information, everything that I'm going to say comes really from a straight up science perspective. Our goal, right, with the liquid biopsy, I'm going to come back to what the liquid biopsy is. Our goal here is, of course, to maximize the amount of information we can extract from that tube of blood. Let's not get hung up over this analyte or that analyte. It's just information, right? So what we want to really do is maximize the amount of information that we can get to. I'm going to come to what we have done in the past in terms of research and what we have put into the clinic. Within our program at USC, and again, this is true for other research programs as well in the liquid biopsy, we typically work across a number of different diseases. So it is a fairly large portfolio of research programs, and it's important because it allows us to actually learn across cancers, and we can benefit across cancers. We can leverage across. A whole other super cool conversation to be had of what does that mean, how does that actually work, and how do we make progress. On the right-hand side, of course, you see the groups, a snapshot of the groups from around the country that we work with in various parts of that exploration. Our multiple myeloma program, for example, is with all of our colleagues at the Farber in Boston, because again, they're just absolutely fantastic colleagues to work with. Just over those past 3 years, just to highlight this quickly, we made this progress from looking at the carrier only to being able to actually start understanding the carrier group. Okay, it's really the simplest way to think about it. We started off only looking for the CTC. And a lot of the first generation technologies are still sort of in that world, okay? But because of the science that we now have done as a community over those past 2 decades, we started realizing, sorry, this was meant to be a different animation, but anyways, we started realizing there's a lot more information to that. There is, of course, the first clinical test is out there, and I'm going to talk about this in a few slides, and that is the Oncotype DX ARV7 Nucleus Detect. We are typically quite good at abbreviations and fun keywords or so. This one I'm not particularly proud of because it's just way too complicated. Bottom line is if your prostate cancer has the variant 7 of the androgen receptor, it will not respond to AR-targeted therapies anymore. It's as simple as that, and I'll show you the data for that in a moment. That was super critical.
Elaborate on that a bit. I don't know what that really means.
I will do that in a couple of slides, Rick, because it's a really important part of what it means and what the consequences are of that. So I'll hustle. But again, just like you mentioned with your wife as well, right? Breast cancer, of course, super important. And the second product that was launched by Epic is called Define MBC. What Define MBC does, which we, from a research perspective, absolutely love, because it's the first test that brings together cell-free DNA analysis together with standard CTC analysis together with single-cell genomics off of the CTCs. Okay, super cool, brand new, super hot, and yes, for a while it'll be expensive, right? But that's just a transition period that we have to get through. Okay, and then we'll figure out how we go from there. We have done work in retinoblastoma. That was our first forte into children's disease, uveal melanoma, and that was again a big step of us working on cancers other than the prostate, other than the tissue cancers, other than the carcinomas. Early detection, again, the keyword of GRAIL and Thrive comes to mind here. Now, what they have done is really they looked only at all of the associated signals that they can find within the ctDNA. So, Rick, if you would have nothing else but sonar, it would probably not be good enough. Okay, you need more than just one signal, a lot more. Okay, our argument is exactly that. Okay, we need visual, we need sonar, we need intelligence. Okay, and that's where we think there is actually, this can be. 10 years ago, I have said this is completely nuts, you guys, this will never work. Today, I would have to say, hey, you know what? I think we're on a super exciting path there. So in prostate cancer, let's do a couple of basics here. Liquid biopsy is just the liquid sample. It is not the test, okay? There's a lot of confusion around that, but that's really all it is, okay? Most often it's blood, but in prostate cancer in particular, bone marrow aspirates are actually pretty darn powerful. And if I can prove the utility of it, okay, then I think one could argue it's very worthwhile, okay? Liquid biopsy contains different analytes, right? It's a tube of blood. It has red blood cells. It has white blood cells, so your entire immune system. It has the plasma, which contains all the proteins like PSA, but it also contains your cell-free DNA, okay? And then it has the rare cells, which are those that are connected to the tumor itself. So the circulating tumor cells and all the associated ones. The questions that we typically have, and again, I always come back to that, what is it that a patient actually wants to know? It's pretty straightforward. Do I have cancer? Yes, no. How bad? This is the diagnosis. Then how bad is it? That's my prognosis, right? Will my treatment work? Be sure, I'd like to know that, right? Not just because it's expensive, but I also have only so many shots on goal. However I want to think about this, I really want to know. Once I'm on this treatment, I know that this will my treatment work is not 100% correct answer, right? So I do need to have some sort of response monitoring. So when it comes to how bad is it, right? In prostate cancer, right, one of the basics around there, right, is active surveillance versus radical prostatectomy. That sure would be nice to get with much higher confidence, right? Because we know that somebody who is truly a Gleason 6 doesn't really have to worry about it, right? We worry about it because that truly Gleason 6 is really complicated. Will my treatment work, right? So if my prostate cancer is AR driven, the AR inhibitors will work. Great. If my prostate cancer is not AR driven, AR inhibitors are likely a wasted opportunity. But it gets a bit gray there, coming back to Rick's point of like, what the hell about the ARV7, Peter? Okay, we'll get to that. Is my treatment working? So traditionally, that's all being done with imaging, right? But imaging, and again, the imaging guys will be like, oh, Peter, our sensitivity is getting better, right? I'm using a cubic centimeter. I mean, go a little higher, a little smaller, right? But that's 1 billion cells. That's a lot of cancer cells. It would sure be nice to go a little earlier than that. If, and this is not a straightforward statement, right? Detecting a recurrence earlier does not directly mean that you will have a better outcome. Okay, this is a really important part here, again, about this Wild West, right? Just because I can detect something does not mean that I can improve the outcome. We on the science side have to prove this. Back in the days, 2 decades ago, experiments were done with imaging in breast cancer that essentially showed that, whether I identify the recurrence a bit earlier or a bit later makes no difference in terms of the overall survival of these patients. But that was because we didn't have that many drugs available. Okay, every drug gives you, an episode of life. So if I only have 2 drugs, I get those 2 episodes. Where I take them a little early, a little later, did not make much of a difference because they were all very similar drugs at the time. This is different today. We have lots of treatment choices. We need to figure out how to be smart about these treatment choices. And now all of a sudden, something that, again, 15 years ago was just a vision and looked cool and all of that, right? All of a sudden, this goes front and center. How do we generate the evidence that proves that we will actually reach better outcomes? And then, so anyway, so that's that part to that. Which drugs relate to which drugs relate to which marker? Again, androgen receptor relates, of course, to androgen deprivation therapy and the androgen receptor signaling inhibitors. So abiraterone, enzalutamide, and the whole cohort around that. PSMA, a new emerging marker, of course, for lutetium-177, right? Again, really important to think our way through that. What does that mean? Because there's lots of consequences even when it comes to imaging. Okay, what used to be called the biochemical relapse because of rising PSA in the absence of evidence of imaging, all of a sudden with PSMA imaging, you see that recurrence much earlier. Okay, let's make sure that we actually get benefit for the patient out of this. The next one is actually measured in the cell-free DNA. I will come to that in a couple of slides. ATM, BRCA1, BRCA2 mutations are a predictor of response to the PARP inhibitors. Again, important. right? If the AR inhibitors are not really an option, what are my alternatives? So ARV7, so the androgen receptor. The androgen receptor, think of this as your fuel pump, okay? So testosterone is your fuel, right? Fuel comes in, fuel pumps goes in, and then just drives the engine, right? So now I want to stop the engine of that cancer cell. How do I do that? Okay, so I can either shut down my androgen production, right? Androgen deprivation therapy. Okay, so that's step one. And you're like, okay, if I just throttle that down, does that work, right? Because if I provide less and less fuel, right, the engine should die. But the engine starts becoming much more efficient. Okay, it needs less and less of that fuel. Okay, okay, improved efficiency. What do I do next? Okay, let me screw with this with the fuel pump itself. Okay, I can block the fuel pump, and that's what the RSI, that's what ABI and ENZA, that's what these are all about. Two different, slightly different mechanisms, but they all screw around with the fuel pump. Okay, so then of course the next thing that happens is this variant 7. Okay, where it starts becoming completely independent of testosterone, of androgen. Now we have a whole different problem. So in the past, up until now, still to this day, the alternative, the only alternative then is to switch over to the taxanes. Okay, so that means we go in and we carpet bomb this whole thing, right? It's ugly, it's a set of shitty drugs, but that's the best we've currently got. Now, the reason why, however, all of this is super important is that when that test came out and we started realizing just how big that gap was in terms of survival, of course, pharma and biotech companies jumped all over this and started building drugs specifically for that patient population. Nothing approved yet, but this is gonna come, hopefully sooner than later. And that cycle of science and research and development really has to be appreciated. It's so super important, right? That is how we make progress, right? Because all of a sudden there's going to be new drugs that are essentially these androgen receptor degraders, okay? They just eat up the entire receptor, right? The science is just all super cool, right? And this again is driven by the fact that we now know how to measure that, right? Really, really important. There's of course the aggressive prostate cancer, and that's complicated. I'll come to that in a moment. Rick, does that in part help sort of your question with regards to the ARV7?
Yeah, and I was on androgen blocking, and then I just failed the taxanes. So and now I've started immunotherapy, PD-1 and adenosine inhibitors with no real evidence that it'll work. And so I just started, so I'm a bit concerned that I got like about a 25% shot that it'll even modulate it. And I'm starting to feel better because I'm not getting killed by taxanes right now. But I'd like to have a backup plan ASAP.
Yeah. No, right? So this is the other part, of course, where the conversation, the research conversation and the clinical conversations are always a little different, right? Because in the research conversation, right, I am trained to always say, what's my next experiment, right? Whereas as a patient in a clinical setting, like, yeah, no, Peter, like I need something, like I need to make a decision today. Okay, this is where the two worlds have to come together and figure out, what does this strategy look like, right? And part of that is really recognizing where we are in the evidence build. What are the risks that we are taking at various points in time? This is super important with the ARV7 though, because it's Howard Scher really pushed that work forward. And what you see there with the difference in survival, so the yellowish line, right, is patients who are positive for ARV7 who just have a much worse prognosis versus those who are ARV7 negative. So they respond to androgen receptor targeted therapies, right? So they do exceedingly well. So that's why, I surely want to know, where I'm at in this spectrum, right? And that was prognostic in the beginning, right? That is what that left-hand side did. So everybody says, like, well, Peter, that's nice, but does it make a difference? Is there an alternative? Is there a backup plan? What if we change, if we change therapy? So on the right-hand side, right, is really then this understanding of, hey, what happens if we actually change therapy? Right? What if we go from a targeted therapy, which is well tolerated, et cetera, right, to a crummy chemotherapy? But you know what? You do get, on average, that ARV7 positive patient gets that better outcome, right? So really, really important. And again, that is what now has driven for those past 6-7 years a huge amount of drug development to move forward with. So a lot of this comes down to asking the right question, right? Asking that clinical context of use. Otherwise, we're just doing research for the sake of research, right? We have to be really thoughtful about that. I always like, and there, a few of you have brought up, what about cell-free DNA versus CTCs? Are they competing? What is it? How do I wrap my head around it? And this all has everything to do with clinical context of use. If I have a caterpillar and a butterfly, okay, really super simple, right? And I ask the question of like, hey, Peter, which one can fly, right? If I sequence their genome, I will not get the answer because their genome is actually identical. It's the genome of the butterfly, right? So I need to do this at the proteome level because that's where they are different. Luckily, there is no pathologist on this call because the pathologist would say, Peter, you ding dong, look at the bloody picture. Look at the thing, right? The left is the caterpillar, the right is the butterfly, okay? Always keep that in mind. Sometimes they're actually fairly simple solutions. Let's not forget that. But this is how to think our way through clinical context of use. I'm going to skip this because otherwise we're going to run out of time. These are all just really cool explanations. But anyways, CTCs have been around since 1868, a little while back. Neither me nor Mehmet Toner in Boston invented it. Okay, just to be clear, it's been around for a while. So what the hell? Why are we still not using this on a daily basis? Okay. Next explanation here, and that again relates to why this is still in the Wild West, right? Is when we think about our immune system, our immune cells in the blood, the white blood cells, right? They are typically, when you get your results back from your standard routine testing, you typically get your white count, or you even get that subsetting, right? And your white count is many thousands, up to 10,000 per microliter of blood. Okay, when we measure CTCs, we measure them in the single digits per milliliter. So 1,000-fold less. Anytime I'm trying to do something that's 1,000-fold better, it gets really, really hard. Okay. And that's why we have to be careful about how we do this. Oftentimes we compare this to a needle in a haystack problem, complicated, fair enough, right? But what we really want to do is then start figuring out, and again, this is where, so Catherine, Alex Panaviers, and us, where we differ in our approach, right? Where her approach, and I'm not saying better or worse, right? This is always about how do these different groups complement each other, right? How do we make for that bigger picture? So she would take this whole haystack, right, and push it through a filter and make the argument that, oh, the cancer hay is bigger than the regular hay. Okay, I'm like, ooh, that's complicated. What I do is we just blow the haystack over a very, very large area, and then we just take one little bit at a time, and we take a picture of it, and then we look at which one is more similar to one another. So what you see in that lower left-hand corner is essentially one blood sample and looking at, hey, which cells are most closely resembling cancer cells and which ones are white blood cells, right? So that's why we love that. We love that because that means we can build up these huge image libraries that we can start comparing against one another, and we can start looking at the biology of the disease, the genomics of the disease, and can bring it all back together in this big cycle of research and going towards a product. When I say this is hard, one way to always think about this is for those of you who love Where is Waldo as a comic book for yourself as a child, for your children or grandchildren or whatever. It's a really good way to think about it. One piece of advice, never ever play Where is Waldo in a competitive way against the pathologist, because you will lose, no matter how you think about it. They're really good at pattern recognition, right? So this is the standard Where is Waldo, right? Once you see Waldo, you're like, oh, of course, this is really straightforward, Peter, right? But can I do this like super fast, right? Very high speed, Where is Waldo, right? And that is when life gets a bit more complicated, because there is lots of stuff that looks pretty darn similar to one another, right? And we need to figure out what is true and what is not true. In fact, as you're training your own brain when you play Where is Waldo, your brain spends probably more time at trying to separate out the false positives. Because the true positive is pretty straightforward, right? It's filtering out the false positives, the ones where you're wondering, okay? And we play that exact same game with a computer science approach. Okay, that's all we really do. Super high speed, really fun computation, high speed, Where is Waldo? That's always how to think about that. What happens next is, and I'm just going to do a couple of more slides. I want to be sensitive to time and I want to open it up for conversation as quickly as possible. But it's important. The upper left-hand side, that one cell that stands there, big, bright red unicolor, okay, that is what we traditionally thought was the CTC. And I, together with many others, this was before Stephanie joined us, have spent a lot of time defining the CTCs, okay? Until somebody slapped us left and right and said, what about the heterogeneity of the disease? And yeah, whatever, that's for the other people. And we're like, no, what about in the blood, right? Why would that not be represented, reflected in the blood? And that's, of course, very, very true, right? In the blood itself, we see the full heterogeneity of that cancer, right? All of the cells that you're seeing on this image, they're all cancer cells in the blood. And the different colors, the different shapes, the different things that are attached to it, they're all representing what that cancer can look like, okay? So the color concept here, just to do this really quick, is blue. Blue is something that we mark the DNA with. So that's the genome, the nucleus of that cell. The green that you're seeing in these cells that are just blue and green, those are your immune cells, okay? Those are just white blood cells. The red that you're seeing is cytokeratin, which is a protein that marks tissue. So now that means that a cell that is blue and red is a tissue cell. Tissue cells have no business being in the circulation, okay? White is a marker that is called vimentin, and it gives us a feel for what we think is a very aggressive disease, because it has managed to figure out how to go through a transition that enables it to travel around the body. Okay, and then the green dots that you see on the right-hand side here, those green dots are essentially a protective layer that's sitting on top of these cancer cells and is probably allowing these cancer cells to be fairly invisible. All of this is biology that we need to work out. We need to work our way through this very, very carefully. So that's why we do this, what we call third generation technology approach, which is what we have developed in the last couple of years, and this is where all the new papers are now coming out from. In our first generation technology, just what I said with this upper left-hand side, we really, our view was all in this looking for the red, okay? And in many ways, now we turn on the color channels. Okay, the third generation technology is just better at delineating the different biologies of these cells. Let's work our way through this, and then I think I'm going to do this and briefly talk about PSMA and then do questions, I think. So there is this concept of an aggressive prostate cancer, and then how do you deal with this? And at some point, Rick was probably asked about, hey, one chemotherapy or do you want two? Because we can give you two chemotherapies at the same time. We can give you sometimes that it really depends, right? Because two chemotherapies are actually double the shitty therapy, right? It gets really crummy at that point. So, but the question is it worth it, right? Does it lead to better outcomes? Because if somebody could tell you, hey, this is going to lead to better outcomes, you'd be like, all right, fine, I'll suffer my way through it. Complicated. And this is the complexity that we're trying to figure out how to set that apart. And again, that's the science around this. This is done with bone marrow aspirates, where again, we can figure out whether or not and this is on the far right-hand side, that dotted line is in this particular disease pattern, giving a patient a doublet chemotherapy actually has real benefit, whereas in some of these other settings, it actually doesn't make a difference. Okay, so again, this is just on the research side. Hopefully, again, this is the kind of data that will then start triggering drug development in pharma as well, right? That's why, again, this is important. Blood and bone marrow won't talk about this. Oncosomes won't talk about it. That's for a future discussion. I'm just going to scroll through this really quick. Oncosomes are essentially these bubbles that come from the tumor itself, and they contain almost all the information except for the genome, as far as we can tell. And they're a big part of the communication path of the disease itself. We just started this work now a couple of years ago, and we're making important progress. We have shown that they exist in prostate cancer, that they carry all of the prostate cancer proteins that we would typically expect, and we'll see how we make them useful over time. I don't want to spend time on this because otherwise we run out. 3 slides left. Somebody asked again, this is coming back to the ctDNA and CTC overlay, right? So this is breast and prostate together. This is a slide I stole from Epic Sciences. It's actually an adaptation from Alex Panabeer's paper that she put out. So there is this combination between what do we learn from the genome, which I can typically get from cell-free DNA, and what is it that I learned from the protein or the proteome, which is what I can typically get from the CTC, right? So ARV7 and PSMA, that's all measured on the cell itself, whereas this combination of BRCA1, BRCA2, and ATM for your PARP inhibitor response, right, that's measured in the cell-free DNA, okay? So that's why, again, these two go hand in hand. PSMA, last 2 slides, really important. New sets of drugs have shown some pretty stunning results. Currently, that's being done with PSMA PET, where available, because again, there's limitations in terms of availability of PSMA PET. And we believe, lower left-hand side, that we can actually supplement that, complement that, maybe even replace that with just a blood draw, which would, of course, give us much broader availability of that. And the first set of experiments, again, those 2 slides, I stole that from Epic as well. Those trials are ongoing to see whether we can measure the equivalent with just a blood draw. So with that, just 2 quick notes here. Our goal is, of course, and we have with this group, this whole question of how can patients actually participate. We need to learn across all patients, and that's a big step that we have to take forward in terms of how we bring the data together. And in the end, oops, sorry, I'm just going to close. I'm just going to close on that slide. Actually, it's a beautiful slide. And then how do we take all of that forward? But I'm going to stop sharing here. And there were a bunch of questions in the, oh, Stephanie, thank you for answering some of them. Perfect. All right, great. Let's open for questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to, maybe I should already know this, but when you talk about cell-free DNA, can you help me understand it real clearly, right quick?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So think about your either primary cancer in the prostate or metastatic disease somewhere else, whether that's, in the bone, typically in the bone, right? And then we know that a cancer is unstable, right? We sometimes talk about the blood vessels being unstable, et cetera, right? Because that is how the cancer actually feeds off of the nutrition that's coming from the blood, by making this all a leaky system. And that means that the cancer leaks into the blood and can start traveling around the body, right? So now the question is, what is it that leaks into the blood? The 2 things that leak into the blood are A, the cancer cells themselves and associated cells, but also when cells die, they fall apart and their nucleus, which contains the entire genome, falls apart as well. So that trash, in many ways, right, all drops into the blood. And if I measure it very, very carefully, I can measure the genome of the cancer. And that is very distinct from any sort of DNA that would come from healthy cells. And
Thank you.
that's what we do with that cell-free DNA. They didn't want to call it, you know, DNA from dead cells because that doesn't sound very attractive. Cell-free sounds a lot cooler. So that worked out really well. Saeed.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. It was great talk. What do you think about the GRAIL multi-cancer test? I believe their positive predictive value is around 44%.
Yeah, so again, here we have to separate out the conversations that are in the setting of previously diagnosed with cancer, any cancer, prostate cancer, and the early detection problem, right? Because the early detection problem is very, very different. And then there's a huge discussion around MSETs, so multi-cancer early detection versus single cancer early detection. The MSETs, as they are designed by GRAIL and Thrive, will be, I think, useful, impactful in identifying those cancers that put those analytes in the blood. Okay, it's just like a PSA test is actually quite good at identifying a cancer or monitoring a cancer that's PSA, so androgen driven. Okay, so if we wrap our head around that and we allow for that, that's okay.
Are you going to pay $1,000 to take that test?
So there's a lot of questions around not just the cost of it. I'm okay with the cost of it, but what is the consequence of it? Because so there's what we're trying to do, right, is what we call downstaging. Okay, we try to avoid patients ever being diagnosed with stage 4 disease. We want everybody to be diagnosed when they're still, stage 1, so they can be treated with curative intent. Okay. Now, I'm going to give a quick example of what's a bit complicated here, and that is, and I learned this being part of some legal issues around women with breast cancer. Every patient who has been diagnosed with cancer, and mammography is great to think our way through that, because that typically women have that on an annual basis, right? So when a woman gets diagnosed with breast cancer, if she pulls up her mammograms from the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, you can start seeing that cancer develop. So the obvious comment here is like, what the hell? I've got a bad doctor because even I can see this last year, a year ago, 2 years ago, right? Well, true for that patient. But at the time, there might have been 10 women who looked just like that. And none of the other 9 actually developed an invasive cancer. Okay, so that's the complexity of it. And that's not underestimated.
It's exactly like the lottery, right? If it's a 6 number, you have 5 numbers, the probability of number 6 is almost 10 million.
Right? So that's the complexity of it. I love it because what happens now next is that pharma and biotech companies are starting to work on what we don't even call early cancer drugs, but we call it early interception, right? So very different ball game in terms of what drug development needs to look like in these super early, maybe even precursor stages. And in addition to the $1,000 question that you just asked, I would say, hey, what are you willing to do if your risk of developing that bad cancer is X? Whole other fun conversation, and maybe we should have that at some point, because I think it's a really important discussion
on target.
Yeah. Rick,
Can I get access to your services and interpretations. I mean, it sounds to me like I've got decisions that would benefit, and I live in Southern California. Can
Yes.
I hang
So-
out with you guys and have? Can you take my blood or?
So this is again where it's really important, right? Where I said, hey, this is all research, right? This is all still at the research level. And the question is, what is actionable? What is actionability? And how do we, back to John's comments, right? Wild West sometimes is actually quite fun. If we know our way around the Wild West, we can actually navigate it. But do I feel pretty good about what we're doing? Yeah, I do feel pretty good about it. But would I want to guide this process? Absolutely not. It needs to be guided by the physician. And the question, Rick, in your particular case, I think the first step would be to have the conversation with the oncologist, right? And play through that entire conversation, through all of the iterations of like, what are the what ifs, right? What is the potential state of the disease, right? How many alternatives are there right now? And what is it that we might find? And what kind of action would that trigger, right? And I think that would be an important conversation to have. And, you know, we are always happy to engage with that conversation, but we would never, ever, ever, because we are research use only, we would never say, oh, yes, I've got a solution for you, because that would be, you know, wrong.
Yeah, what happens for me is I'm at UCLA, and I'm about to see I call him Dr. T at Providence St. John's. At UC
Who is your physician at UCLA?
Shen, Dr. Shen,
Okay.
John Shen.
Okay.
And I'm only his patient because I signed up for an ARCUS PD-1 adenosine inhibitor. So I'm on a clinical trial. That's the only reason he's running the clinical trial.
Got it.
So,
Because we do work, believe it or not, again, publicly, USC and UCLA, we piss into each other's sandbox as much as we possibly can. Privately, we actually all collaborate. We're all
right.
really good. We're all really good colleagues. So we do quite a bit of work with UCLA. We just don't talk about it publicly.
So my point is, real quick, he's Dr. Shen. So I failed the taxane. And he said, okay, well, what do you want to do? And he's a very much, what do you want to do? You're a smart guy, Rick. I used to work at Amgen for 17 years, by the way. And so I said, well, I want to live. What do you think? And he goes, if you go to 10 oncologists, you're going to get 10 different next therapy choices. So that wasn't very comforting.
Nope.
And then City of Hope, Tanya Dorf, she said, well, you've got a lot of options on the table. One is I have a CDK12 driver that is maybe a PARP responder. It's a gray area. But she said in the event of a tie, I would take evidence that would point one way or another. So that's kind of opened up in my mind. And then I don't know if you guys know, but I've been working with Nick. I'm in a people's protocol at TGen, and where they're trying to open access to research use only assays. Anyway.
And Tanya is probably one of the most talented, super cool young prostate oncologists. So again, that would be a great and again, good colleague, great colleague and friend. So we should engage there.
Excuse me, I'm going to jump in here just because I'm noticing the time and I want to be respectful of people's time. I'm going to stop the recording now, but we're free to stay on and continue the conversation. I have a question, and I see John has a question for you, but if you need to jump off the call, thanks for being here. I'm going to stop the recording and it'll be available online. And thank you so much, Peter and Stephanie.